Not every story begins with a spark. Some begin in the quiet, where a girl is forgotten, where love is withheld, and where worth is measured by things that should never matter. But sometimes, from the stillness, a voice begins to rise. This is the story of Margaret Sinclair, a girl once sold for silver, a woman who would come to learn that strength can bloom in silence and that beauty lives far beyond what the world can see. In the winter of 1873, a young girl's life was traded for 30 pieces of silver. Margaret Rose Sinclair was only 17 when her mother looked her in the eyes, and without flinching, sold her to a stranger for the price of a pair of worn boots. 30 silver coins. That's all it took to erase a childhood, to declare that a daughter, her own daughter, was too plain, too awkward, too unworthy to be anything more than hired help on a faraway ranch. Her mother didn't even try to soften the truth. She spoke plainly, with eyes that no longer held warmth. She's strong as any boy. She works hard. That's worth something. But even those words carried the weight of disappointment, like Margaret's life had been reduced to a set of chores and a lack of beauty. Let's take a moment to let that sink in. Imagine being told, not just by strangers but by your own family, that your value depends on how you look, that because you're not pretty enough, love, education, and dreams are no longer part of your future. Just labor, just survival, just utility. Margaret didn't have golden curls or porcelain skin like the other girls in Cheyenne. No ribbons in her hair, no praise whispered into her ear. All she ever heard was, "At least you have a good heart." As if that was a consolation prize. As if kindness was a second-class trait when beauty wasn't in the picture. Her home was a cramped wooden cabin built by her late father's hands. It should have been a place of warmth, of memories. But that night, it felt like a prison. The same walls that once echoed with laughter now stood silent as Margaret overheard the final deal being made in the next room. 30 silver pieces. The same number she had heard once in church. Judas' price for betrayal. That irony didn't escape her. And what was she sold for? Not for marriage, not for a future, but to work, cook, clean, serve on a harsh ranch, where books were a luxury and survival was the only education offered. It's easy to villainize her mother, to see her as cold, unloving. But when you peel back the layers, there's something more heartbreaking. Her mother wasn't a monster. She was a woman drowning, trapped in a time where women like her had no choices, no safety nets, no second chances. She was trying to save the rest of the family the only way she knew how. And somehow, Margaret became the cost of that desperate math. But here's the part that stays with me most. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stood in the darkness of her tiny bedroom, wrapped her few belongings in an old quilt, and made a silent promise to herself. No matter what waited on that ranch, she would not let it break her. This is where Margaret's journey begins, not in beauty, not in love, not even in hope, but in a quiet defiance, a spark, a belief, however faint, that 30 silver pieces could never define her worth. And maybe, just maybe, that belief would be enough to carry her through what came next. The Wyoming Territory in the 1870s wasn't the romanticized frontier we often imagine in books. It was wild, brutal, and for families like the Sinclairs, it was a daily battle for survival. Winters came early and left late. The wind cut through walls like knives. Food was never guaranteed, and sickness, once it entered your home, rarely left without taking someone with it. For Margaret's family, that someone had been her father. Fever took him in a matter of days, leaving behind a cabin built with his own hands, 3 children, and a widow who had no real tools to carry them through the storms. Imagine a woman, in her mid-30s, already aged by hardship, staring down another bitter winter with empty shelves, unpaid debts, and a son whose cough was getting worse by the hour. There was no welfare, no community aid, just choices, most of them impossible. This was the reality Margaret's mother faced. She wasn't heartless, she was desperate. And desperation does strange, terrible things to love. It redefines what sacrifice looks like. It can convince a mother that selling her daughter isn't cruelty, it's salvation. At least for the ones who remain. It's easy for us to judge from the comfort of hindsight, to ask why a mother would trade her child for silver. But when you're counting coins to buy medicine, and the snow is already falling in September, the line between right and wrong starts to blur. Especially when society around you keeps whispering that a girl who isn't beautiful is nothing but a burden. Margaret had never heard words like precious or darling. Her mother, hardened by grief and exhaustion, only had practical things to say. You're strong. You work hard. You're not soft like the others. It was never meant to be cruel. But it carved deep into Margaret's heart all the same. Their home was a tiny 3-room cabin. It had once been filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and the smell of wildflower tea her grandmother used to brew. But now, it was shrinking by the day, walls closing in with silence and unspoken fears. What once felt like shelter had become a cage of survival. And so, when Thomas Barrett knocked on their door with 30 silver coins in his pocket and a wife in need of help on the ranch, Margaret's mother made the most unthinkable decision of her life. She handed her daughter away, not because she stopped loving her, but because, in a cruel world, it felt like the only choice that might offer Margaret shelter, food, and a future, even if that future came without warmth. What Margaret didn't know then, as she watched the coins flicker like firelight in her mother's trembling hands, was that she was walking not just into hardship, but into a destiny that would prove beauty isn't measured in mirrors, and worth can't be bought or sold. Because sometimes, the most unforgiving places are where the fiercest flowers bloom. And Margaret? She was about to bloom in a way no one saw coming. Margaret Sinclair had always known she wasn't what the world considered beautiful. She knew it in the way the girls in Cheyenne looked at her, quick glances followed by whispers. She saw it in the mirror each morning, freckles scattered like dust across her pale skin, auburn hair that never stayed put, a nose that had bent slightly when she fell from a tree at 10. Her dresses were plain, her hands calloused from years of chores, and her reflection rarely smiled back. But the real pain? It wasn't the mirror. It was the quiet absence of love, the kind of love that makes you feel seen. The other girls had mothers who called them my precious or my little beauty. Their braids were tied with ribbons, their cheeks kissed before church. Margaret's mother never said those words. Instead, she offered sighs and phrases that tried to console, but always landed like stones. Well, beauty isn't everything, or at least you have a good heart. At least. It's a phrase that clings to girls like Margaret. A reminder that who you are is only tolerable if balanced by something else. Not pretty, then be useful. Not graceful, then work harder. Be small, be quiet. Be grateful. And so Margaret learned early to look away when compliments were given. She stepped out of group photos, avoided dances, and stayed near the kitchen at every social gathering. Because when no one tells you you're worthy of attention, you start to believe you're not. What society doesn't often admit is how cruel its measurements can be, especially for girls. Especially when those measurements are passed down from one generation to the next like heirlooms, wrapped in well-meaning advice and masked as truth. But here's the deeper truth. The most dangerous thing isn't being told you're not beautiful. It's believing that means you don't deserve love. And that's what Margaret carried with her. Not just the freckles or the crooked nose, but the weight of being unseen. She longed for something simple, not grand romance or fame, but just to be chosen. To be looked at like she mattered. Like she was enough. I think so many women, regardless of time or place, understand that ache. It crosses generations, cultures, and languages. We learn young to compare ourselves, to measure, to compete, to shrink. and it takes years, sometimes a lifetime, to unlearn it. But Margaret's story was never about becoming beautiful in the world's eyes. It was about learning to see herself differently, to recognize that softness is strength, that kindness is power, and that love, real love, isn't given because of how you look, but because of who you are when no one's watching. And though her mother couldn't give her those words, someone else would. Someone who saw past what the world dismissed. But that part of the story comes later. For now, all we need to know is this: Margaret wasn't lacking beauty. She was just surrounded by people who didn't know how to see it yet. Margaret Sinclair left home before dawn. The sky hadn't even opened its eyes, and already she was standing at the edge of everything she had ever known, clutching a bundle of her few belongings and preparing to step into a future she hadn't chosen. There were no tearful goodbyes. Just a quick hug from her mother, a whispered, "Be good," and then silence. The kind of silence that speaks more than words ever could. Her little brother, Jake, ran up at the last minute, pressing a smooth river rock into her palm. "For luck," he whispered, his voice cracking. That goodbye hurt more than any others, because Jake was the only one who had ever looked at her without judgment, the only one who had ever made her feel like she mattered. And then came the sound of hooves. Mr. Barrett was waiting, already seated in the wagon, his face unreadable, his voice clipped and practical. "3 days by wagon," he said. "We'll camp 2 nights. My wife will explain your duties." It wasn't cruel, it was just empty. As if this kind of transaction had happened before. As if a girl's life could be folded up like laundry and handed over without fuss. Margaret climbed in beside him, her heart heavy, her throat tight, and as the wagon pulled away, she turned one last time to look at the cabin she'd called home for 17 years. It looked smaller now, as if her leaving had somehow shrunk it. Maybe it always had been that small, maybe. She had just outgrown it. The journey westward was long and quiet. Mr. Barrett didn't make small talk, didn't ask about her past. He pointed out rivers, hills, and trails like a man mapping territory he had conquered. Margaret stayed silent, watching the land unfold around her like a world she'd never been invited into. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly in every direction, golden grass bending in the wind like waves, sky so wide it felt like it could swallow you whole. At night, they camped beneath the stars. Margaret lay wrapped in her grandmother's old quilt, the river rock from Jake still tucked in her hand. The fire crackled, the coyotes sang in the distance, and in that strange space between what was and what might be, she made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let this place break her, because deep down, under the ache, there was something else, a small, stubborn spark. The same spark that had always lived inside her, even when no one saw it. The spark that whispered, "You are more than what they called you, more than what they sold you for." She didn't know it yet, but this journey, this forced beginning, wasn't the end of her story. It was the first step toward becoming someone she had never been allowed to be. Not just useful, not just quiet and obedient, but strong, brave, and deeply, undeniably worthy. Sometimes, it's the moment we're cast aside that gives us the space to finally rise. Margaret had always imagined that when she left home, it would be with a sense of pride, maybe even excitement, some grand turning of the page. But real goodbyes, the kind that stay with you long after they're said, rarely feel grand. Most of the time they come quietly, without warning. Like something being taken from you before you're ready to let it go. That morning, the air was cold with the sharp edge of autumn. Frost glazed the windows of the Sinclair cabin, and inside, everything felt strangely still. The kind of stillness that knows change is coming. Margaret dressed in her best dress, blue cotton with tiny white flowers. It had been sewn by her mother 2 years earlier, back when there was still a small hope she might be noticed at a church social. Now that same dress was her armor, her goodbye. Her mother didn't say much. The woman who had once braided her hair, who had nursed her through childhood fevers and taught her how to knead bread and stack firewood, stood stiffly by the stove. Her movements were mechanical, like someone trying to hold herself together. She offered bacon and coffee, her voice flat, her eyes not quite meeting Margaret's. "Eat something. Long trip ahead." Margaret tried to force down a bite, but her stomach was knotted too tightly to swallow. This wasn't just a breakfast, it was a countdown. When it was time to leave, the farewell was brief. Too brief. A quick hug. A whispered, "Be good." Her mother didn't cry, not where Margaret could see. But her shoulders were tense, and her hands trembled as they clutched the edge of the table. Maybe she didn't know how to say more. Or maybe saying more would have broken something neither of them could afford to shatter. But then came Jake. Her little brother came running from the neighbor's house, his boots kicking up dust, hair tousled, cheeks red from the morning chill. At 13, he was already taller than Margaret and growing into the kind of boy their mother never worried about. He had charm, good looks, a future that others could see. But to Margaret, he had always just been Jake, her shadow, her fiercest ally, the one who never once called her ugly, who never made her feel like a burden. The only person who saw her not for what she lacked, but for all she was. "Maggie, wait." He called out, using the nickname only he was allowed to say. He pressed something into her palm, a smooth river rock, polished by time and summer afternoons. They had found it together months ago, skipping stones by the creek, laughing like the world hadn't yet closed in around them. "For luck," he said, voice cracking just a little. Margaret couldn't speak. She just nodded, eyes burning, throat tight. She memorized his face, the way his hair curled at the temples, the little scar on his chin from climbing the barn roof, the way he looked at her like she was someone worth holding on to. And then she was climbing into the wagon dot as the wheels began to turn, the sound of hooves echoing across the hard earth. Margaret looked back. The cabin grew smaller with each bump in the road until it disappeared behind a hill, taking with it 17 years of being someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who had never felt quite enough. She didn't know what waited for her at the ranch. But she knew this. Wherever she was going, Jake Stone was in her pocket, and his belief in her was something no one could take away. Sometimes the smallest goodbye holds the loudest echo. The wagon rattled along the dusty road, wheels creaking under the weight of the unknown. Margaret sat stiffly on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, clutching the edge of her quilt as if it could anchor her to something familiar. Beside her sat the man who now, in every practical sense, owned her labor, Thomas Barrett. He wasn't cruel. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. He didn't sneer, didn't look at her like damaged goods or remind her she'd been purchased. Instead, he rode in silence, eyes focused ahead, his weathered hands steady on the reins. He was a man shaped by work and wind, carved more by the land than by words. His clothes were plain but clean, his boots worn but solid. And though he rarely spoke, when he did, his voice held no malice, only matter-of-fact certainty. It was strange, in a way. Margaret had braced herself for something colder, sharper, someone who would treat her like a transaction. Instead, Thomas Barrett treated her like a hired hand. Nothing more, but also nothing less. He pointed out landmarks with brief nods. "That's Crow Creek." Or, "We'll pass Miller's trading post by tomorrow." He spoke of the ranch not as a place of power, but of necessity. The animals needed feeding. The men needed meals. The work never stopped. And that, he made clear, was why she was coming. Margaret listened, absorbing the rhythm of his voice, the unspoken code of his expectations. He didn't ask about her family, didn't mention her mother or the coins exchanged. And somehow that silence was kinder than any apology. When they stopped to rest by a creek that shimmered in the late afternoon sun, Mr. Barrett handed her a strip of jerky and a piece of hardtack. Not as a gesture of pity, but as an equal share of his simple meal. He didn't fuss, didn't explain. Just passed it over and went about chewing his own, watching the horses drink. It was a small thing. But to Margaret, it meant something. For so long, she had felt less than the pretty girls, less than what her mother wanted, less than what the world valued. But sitting by that creek, sharing a quiet lunch with a stranger who neither coddled nor condemned her, she felt human. At one point, Mr. Barrett asked, "You scared?" She almost lied, almost said no, that she was fine. But something about the vast open land, the sky that seemed too big to lie beneath, gave her permission to be honest. "Yes," she whispered. "Good," he replied, without looking at her. "Means you've got sense." Folks who ain't scared usually aren't paying attention. It was the most personal thing he'd said all day, and it stuck with her. Not because it comforted her, but because it respected her fear. It didn't ask her to be brave right away, it just acknowledged that being afraid didn't mean she was weak. This wasn't home. Not yet, but for the first time since she left everything behind, Margaret felt a sliver of safety. A fragile kind. Of hope, because maybe, just maybe, this man wasn't the end of her freedom. Maybe he was the beginning of something else. Something real. Something earned, and something she could grow into. When Margaret first laid eyes on the Circle B ranch, it didn't feel like home. It felt like something between a storm and a miracle. The place stretched wide across the valley, bustling with life and motion. Horses darted through the fields. Ranch hands shouted to each other across the yard. It wasn't calm, it wasn't quiet, but it was full of purpose. And at the heart of it all stood a woman with flour on her apron and strength in her eyes. "Margaret?" The woman called, her voice warm, like bread just pulled from the oven. "I'm Elizabeth Barrett, but everyone calls me Mrs. Barrett. Welcome to our little piece of heaven and chaos." That moment changed something in Margaret. She had prepared herself for coldness, for indifference. She had steeled her heart against more rejection. But Mrs. Barrett didn't look at her like a burden. She didn't scan her face for flaws or assess her worth in silence. Instead, she reached out with a hand dusted in flower petals and kindness, and offered something rare, belonging. Mrs. Barrett didn't talk down to her. She didn't sugarcoat the work ahead, either. "You'll be cooking for 12 hungry men, 3 times a day," she said, leading Margaret into a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and something comforting. "They work hard, they eat more. But don't worry, I'll teach you everything." And she did. She showed Margaret how to stretch dough with love, how to time the bacon so it never burned, how to keep the coffee hot without bitterness. But more than that, she taught Margaret how to move through this new world with dignity. Every corner of the house carried her touch, from the polished table to the wildflowers, tucked into a jar by the WINDOWSILL. Mrs. Barrett gave Margaret a room of her own, small, yes, but with a window that looked out over the valley, and a bed wrapped in clean quilts that smelled like lavender and pine. "It's not much," she said, "but it's yours. Out here, privacy is gold." Margaret unpacked slowly. Her father's worn Bible, the pressed wildflower her grandmother once gave her. A small mirror, cracked at the edge but honest in its reflection. And tucked in the folds of her dress, the silver thimble she carried like a piece of love. When Mrs. Barrett saw it, her expression softened. "My grandmother had one just like that," she said. Passed it down with a promise that the smallest things often carry the biggest magic. And in that moment, Margaret believed it. For the first time in her life, she felt like someone wasn't just giving her space. They were making space for her, teaching her, trusting her, seeing her. There's something extraordinary about being welcomed, not tolerated, not used, but truly welcomed into a new chapter of life. It doesn't erase the pain of what came before, but it starts to soften it. It plants seeds in places you thought had gone barren. Margaret had no idea what would come next. But as she stood in the kitchen beside Mrs. Barrett, sleeves rolled up and heart still tender, she realized something simple and quietly profound. She was no longer surviving. She was starting to live. For the first time in her life, Margaret woke up to a world where she was needed, not pitied, not ignored, not judged for what she wasn't, but valued for what she did. Every morning at Circle B Ranch began before the sun. The kitchen came alive. In the dark hours, long before the first rooster called, Margaret would roll up her sleeves, tie back her hair, and begin the rhythm of something that felt, surprisingly, like purpose. The fire needed lighting. Biscuits needed baking. 12. Men tired, hungry, and soaked in dust would walk through that door, expecting a hot meal and a full coffee pot. And she made it happen. At first, her hands shook. She oversalted the stew, burned the bottom of the cornbread. But Mrs. Barrett didn't scold, she taught. Quietly, patiently, like someone who believed in her long before Margaret learned to. Believe in herself. With each meal, Margaret grew steadier. The kitchen, once a space of pressure, became her domain. She memorized what each ranch hand liked best, who added sugar to their coffee, who hated onions, who smiled silently after the first bite, but never said thank you out loud. It wasn't just cooking, it was connection. It was care. Outside the kitchen, she scrubbed floors, washed linens, mended clothes by lantern light. She learned the quiet satisfaction of clean sheets, of a swept porch, of organizing the pantry just right. These weren't glamorous tasks, but they were grounding. They reminded her that being needed wasn't a burden, it was a kind of love in motion. And more importantly, she started doing things for herself. Margaret began tending a small herb garden. Near the back steps, lavender, sage, mint. It was her space, her creation. She kept her room neat, tucked wildflowers into an old glass bottle on the windowsill, wrote little thoughts in the margins of her father's Bible. She no longer flinched at her reflection in the mirror. Her freckles hadn't disappeared. Her hair still had a mind of its own. But now she saw strength there. A girl becoming a woman, one quiet triumph at a time. For so long, Margaret had believed value came from beauty, from being seen and admired. But life on the ranch was showing her something else. Value could come from showing up, from learning, from sweating through the work and realizing you're good at something that matters. There's something sacred about doing work that others depend on. It doesn't just fill your day, it fills your soul. The kind of work that doesn't shout for applause but hums with dignity. Margaret still had moments of doubt, still felt echoes of the girl who'd been sold for 30 coins. But every time someone asked for her help, thanked her for supper, or simply smiled across the table, a part of her healed, because she was no longer just surviving someone else's story. She was writing her own with every loaf of bread, every mended shirt. Every morning she chose to rise and begin again, and maybe, just maybe, this was what real worth looked like. Quiet, steady, earned with her own 2 hands. The first time Margaret heard his voice, it didn't sound like anything extraordinary. It wasn't booming or theatrical. It didn't try to impress. No, it was something softer, warmer. A melody drifting through the kitchen window just as the morning sun was rising, wrapped in the scent of bread and fresh-cut wood. It stopped her in her tracks. She dropped the pot of beans she was holding. And for a moment, the chaos of the ranch disappeared, replaced by a song about longing and home that felt like it was written for her. "That's steady," Mrs. Barrett said with a knowing smile, appearing in the doorway with an armful of eggs. Real name's James Morrison, but no one calls him that anymore. Been here 3 years. Best man with a horse I've ever seen. And that voice could charm angels right out of heaven. Margaret wasn't the type to get flustered. She had spent most of her life unseen, blending into corners and focusing on being useful. But something about that voice and the man behind it sent a flutter through her chest that she didn't recognize. She glanced through the window and saw him for the first time. He was brushing down a black mare, The kind of horse that looked like it belonged in a storybook, not a dusty corral. Steady moved slowly, gently, as if he were part of the rhythm of the earth itself. His hands were rough, his clothes plain, but there was a quiet grace in how he moved, like he didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and when he smiled, just a quick, easy smile at something the horse did, his whole face lit up. Not in the way people smile for show, but in that rare way that makes you believe goodness still exists in the world. He wasn't the most handsome man Margaret had ever seen, but there was something undeniable about him. Something grounding. Like standing next to a tall pine during a storm and knowing it won't bend. Mrs. Barrett must have noticed the way Margaret lingered by the window, her face flushed. "He's got that effect on people," she said gently. "Not because of how he looks, but because of how he sees." That stayed with Margaret. Because, for most of her life, no one had really seen her. They'd seen her freckles, her crooked nose, her calloused hands. They'd seen what she wasn't, but as she watched Steady coax a frightened gray mare with nothing but patience and that same quiet song, something inside her shifted. He didn't force. He didn't command. He just waited, trusted, and let the animal come to him in her own time. It was the kind of tenderness that didn't ask for attention, but deserved it anyway. And for the first time, Margaret wondered what it might feel like. To be looked at that way, not judged, not fixed, but accepted. She didn't know it yet. But that moment watching Steady sing to a skittish horse under the early light of the Wyoming sky was the beginning of everything. The beginning of being seen. The beginning of becoming more than just strong or hardworking. The beginning of a kind of love that doesn't shout, but settles deep in your bones. A kind of love that teaches you to believe what no one ever told you, that you are already enough. There was something about the way Steady moved around horses that felt more like conversation than control. He didn't bark commands or use force. He listened, waited, let silence do half the work. And as strange as it may sound, that's what first made Margaret trust him, not just as a man, but as a teacher. She had never been close to horses before. Not really. She'd seen them from a distance, hauling wagons or grazing in pastures. But they were always someone else's responsibility too. Big, too wild, too powerful for a girl like her to handle. At least, that's what she thought. Until one morning, Steady walked up beside her at the fence and simply asked, "Want to give it a try?" She hesitated. Her instinct was to say no, to shrink back into the safe world of flour, firewood, and folded linens. But there was no judgment in his voice, only an invitation. And maybe that's what made her say yes. The horse he brought out wasn't fierce, but she was nervous. A young black mare with wide eyes and a tense body, the kind of animal that had learned to flinch before it learned to trust. Margaret understood that feeling, deeply. "Start by letting her see you," Steady said, keeping his voice low. "Let her come to you, not the other way around." Margaret stood still, heart thudding in her chest, hands slightly trembling. But she followed his lead. She breathed slowly, spoke gently, and waited. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then one step. Then another. And finally, the mare stretched out her neck and touched her nose to Margaret's palm. It felt like a miracle. Like something sacred had been offered and accepted. "She trusts you," Steady said with a small smile. "Because you didn't rush her." That moment stayed with Margaret. Not just because she'd touched a horse, but because it was the first time someone had given her space to succeed on her own terms. No pressure, no test. Just faith and a little guidance. Over the next few weeks, she spent more time near the corral than she ever imagined she would. Steady showed her how to read a horse's eyes, how to use her breath like a bridge, how to step with calm intention. She learned that every horse had a story, a personality. Some were bold. Some were shy. Some carried invisible scars that made them flinch when touched the wrong way. It reminded her so much of people. One afternoon, as they worked together in quiet harmony, Margaret asked, "Do horses ever really forget the things that hurt them?" Steady paused, then said, "No, but they can learn to live beyond them if someone's patient enough to wait." He wasn't just talking about horses. That realization hit her gently, like sunlight warming her back. This wasn't just about animals, it was about healing, about trust, about someone showing her that slow is not the same as weak, and that gentleness, both given and received, is one of the bravest things we can offer the world. In Steady's presence, Margaret wasn't being fixed. She was being invited to unfold, and every time a horse took a step toward her, it felt like the world was saying, "See? You're more capable than you think. You're more seen than you know." Sometimes the most life-changing words aren't shouted or dramatic. They don't come in declarations or promises. Sometimes they're said quietly in passing, like truth simply being spoken aloud for the first time. That's how it happened with Margaret. She was standing beside Steady in the barn one afternoon, brushing down a nervous mare whose ribs still showed the marks of neglect. The animal had been skittish for days, flinching at every sound, every shadow. But under Margaret's touch, something softened. The mare stopped shaking. Her breathing steadied. And that's when Steady said it. Not looking at her, not trying to flatter, just noticing. "You've got gentle hands," he said. "The kind horses trust. The kind people should too." It took a moment for Margaret to respond. Not because she didn't hear him, but because no one had ever said anything like that to her before. Not pretty hands. Not clever hands. Not useful hands. Gentle. For a girl who'd spent her life being told she was strong like a boy. Rough around the edges, better suited for chores than charm. That one word cracked something open inside her. Gentle. It wasn't a weakness. It was a gift. You see, we don't talk enough about the strength of gentleness. In a world that celebrates the loud, the bold, the assertive, it's easy to forget that tenderness takes courage too. That healing hands, soft voices, and patient hearts are what hold broken things together. Margaret had been told her whole life what she wasn't. Not beautiful, not delicate, not enough. But here was a man who wasn't trying to change her. He was reflecting something true back to her that she hadn't yet seen in herself. And maybe that's what real love looks like. Not just admiration, not infatuation, but recognition. The kind of connection that says, "I see you." Not the version you think you need to be, just you, and you are good. From that moment on, Margaret began to move differently. Not for others. Not to prove anything. But because she had started to believe that her presence, her hands, her heart brought comfort. And that made her feel worthy in a way she never had before. And isn't that what we all long for, deep down? To be reminded that our softness is not our flaw, it's our strength. That we are allowed to be both capable and kind, both resilient and warm. And that someone, somewhere, might look at us not with critique, but with quiet awe. Margaret didn't say anything back to Steady that day. She didn't need to. She just kept brushing the mare in silence, her touch steady, her heart full. And, though she wouldn't realize it until much later, that simple moment, those 4 small words had planted the seed of a new truth. She was more than enough. She was already everything she needed to be. At 17, Margaret Sinclair had already been sold, sent away, and overlooked. In the eyes of most, she was just another plain girl with no real place in the world. But that was before the day she chose to risk everything, not for recognition, not for glory, but because she knew what it felt like to have nowhere left to run. The Circle B Ranch had become more than a job. It had become a fragile kind of home. For the first time, she felt needed. She had a rhythm: early mornings, long days, tired hands, full hearts. And just as she began to believe that maybe this place could be hers, the danger she thought she'd left behind came thundering back in the form of hooves and gunpowder. The Dawson gang was notorious across the Wyoming Territory men who took what they wanted and didn't care who they crushed to get it. That morning, word came like a punch to the chest. They'd hit a neighboring ranch, burned it, stolen cattle, armed and moving fast. And now, they were coming straight for Circle B. While the ranch hands scrambled to prepare, Margaret stood frozen by the kitchen window, heart pounding. It would have been easy to stay inside, hide, let the men fight. That's what was expected of her, what most would have done. But Margaret knew this land now. She'd walked its ridges, listened to Steady talk about the old trails, the weak spots in the terrain. And as fear rose like wildfire in her chest, so did something else: clarity. There was one path the Dawsons might use to flank the ranch. A narrow ridge trail above the barn, steep, rocky, easy to miss unless you'd spent weeks exploring it on foot. And Margaret had. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't wait for permission. She just moved, quiet boots, fast breath, determination like steel in her spine. By the time she reached the ridge, she saw them, two of the outlaws creeping into position, rifles slung, planning to attack from above. She had no weapons, no plan, just the landscape and her instinct. That's when she started rolling the rocks. One, then another, then all of them, sending a thunderous avalanche down the slope. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't calculated, but it worked. One man was knocked off his feet, the other scrambling. But when they saw her, this slip of a girl with fire in her eyes, they didn't laugh. They chased. She ran down the hill through brush and thorn, boots skidding on loose earth. She wasn't faster, but she was braver and smarter. She led them straight toward the ranch, where Steady and the others had already taken cover. By the time one of the outlaws raised his weapon, Steady's shot rang out clean, sharp, and true. It disarmed the man before he could hurt her. The rest of the Dawson gang, realizing their ambush had failed, turned tail and disappeared into the dust. When it was over, Margaret didn't expect applause. She didn't need it, but what she got was silence. The kind of silence that settles when people witness something they didn't know they needed to see. A quiet girl with a past no one envied had just saved them all. And in that moment, under the wide Wyoming sky, Margaret stopped being the girl they pitied. She became the woman they respected. Not because she was fearless, but because she acted despite her fear. Because sometimes, the real heroes aren't the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes they're the ones who simply refuse to let fear decide who they get to be. After the dust settled and the Dawson gang was gone, something shifted at Circle B Ranch. It wasn't loud. There were no speeches, no medals, no grand declarations. But Margaret could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the way they didn't look away anymore. For most of her life, Margaret had been the girl people overlooked. The one whose name was said with a shrug, whose presence never seemed to change a room. At home, she'd been the daughter who didn't turn heads, the sister who was never quite enough. But here, on this patch of land carved out of hard earth and harder weather, she'd become something else entirely. A protector, a leader, a woman who ran toward danger, not from it, and people noticed. The ranch hands, who once barely offered her more than polite nods at supper, now tipped their hats and asked her advice. Mrs. Barrett, usually composed and efficient, started watching Margaret with a quiet kind of pride, as if something she'd hoped for had bloomed right in front of her eyes. Even Mr. Barrett, a man not known for soft words, gave a gruff nod at dinner one night and simply said, "You've got grit. Real grit." But maybe most telling of all was how the silence around her had changed. It used to be the kind of silence that filled the air around someone invisible. Now it was a silence of reverence, of awareness. Like everyone understood that when things went wrong, this woman, the same one who once flinched at her own reflection, was the one who could be counted on. Margaret didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't bask in admiration. But inside, something was healing. For the first time, she wasn't being pitied or tolerated or judged for what she lacked. She was respected for what she did, and even more than that, for who she had become. Respect, she realized, wasn't about impressing people. It was about being consistent. Being kind when it wasn't easy. Being strong when no one asked you. Being willing to act when it would have been easier to stay quiet. And isn't that what so many of us crave? Not fame, not flattery, but that deep, steady kind of acknowledgement that says, I see your courage. I see your heart. Margaret had spent so long trying not to be seen that when people finally looked at her, truly looked at her, it felt almost unreal, but it was happening. Not because she'd changed how she looked, but because she had changed how she lived. She had shown up at a moment that mattered. And in doing so, she proved to herself and to everyone else that real beauty lives in action. That bravery wears all kinds of faces. And that sometimes, the girl the world called plain is the one who ends up holding the story together. In the eyes of Circle B Ranch, Margaret was no longer just the girl who'd been sold for silver. She was the woman who stood her ground. And that made all the difference. There are moments in a woman's life that ask her to become more than she ever imagined, when fear meets love, and something stronger rises to the surface. For Margaret, that moment came on a cold, windswept morning when Steady didn't come. It started as a whisper. Someone had seen him ride toward the canyon trail at dawn, just before the sun broke over the hills. By noon, the whisper turned into worry. By dusk, the truth surfaced like a wound. Steady had been captured. Ambushed by the last of the Dawson gang, desperate and scattered, clinging to revenge like broken men do. Panic took hold of the ranch. Mr. Barrett gathered his best riders. The hands readied rifles. Everyone waited for a plan. But Margaret didn't. Wait, because something deeper than panic stirred in her chest. She remembered the voice that once told her she had gentle hands, the same voice that had trusted her when she didn't trust herself. And now he needed her, not as a damsel, not as a witness, but as the one who could bring him back. Margaret didn't ride out with guns or brute force. That wasn't her strength. What she had was sharper intuition, courage, and a clear head. She remembered the ridge path narrow, often overlooked. She knew where the Dawsons might hold a prisoner, and she knew how to get there without being seen. But it wasn't enough just to find him. She had to outsmart men who knew how to kill Dot, so she came with a lie. She dressed in her oldest clothes, smeared dust across her face, and rode out alone, unarmed. She approached the camp with a limp in her gait and desperation in her voice. I heard the ranch is sending 10 men, she said. They're coming from the north. If you want to survive, you better run now. Her voice cracked just enough to sound real. Her eyes held just enough fear to be believed. The men, tired, bitter, wounded from loss, took the bait. Within minutes, they scattered. Some ran toward the trees, others leapt on horses. In the chaos, Margaret slipped into the tent where Steady was tied. His lip was bloodied, his face swollen. But when he saw her, something softened in his eyes. Not surprise, not even relief. Just faith. He always knew she'd come. She cut him loose with a pocket knife Mrs. Barrett had once given her, just in case. Together, they crept through the trees, mounted the horse she'd hidden, and rode hard into the dusk. The wind tore at their faces, but Margaret didn't stop until the ranch lights came into view. That night, the fire in the dining room burned brighter than usual. The hands raised their glasses. Mr. Barrett clapped her on the back and called her the smartest rider we've got. Mrs. Barrett cried quiet tears into her apron. And Steady, he didn't say much, but the way he looked at her said everything. It didn't feel like a fairy tale. There was no music swelling in the background, no kiss beneath the stars. Just two people who had seen each other at their worst and still chosen to show up. Margaret had been sold, silenced, underestimated, but now she had saved a life, and not just Steady's, her own. One crisp autumn morning, Just as the frost kissed the edge of the windows at Circle B Ranch, a letter arrived. Folded neatly, sealed with wax, and addressed in a hand Margaret hadn't seen in years. The handwriting was unmistakable, her mother's. She didn't open it right away. For a moment, she just stood by the kitchen table, the letter resting like a weight in her palm. The past has a way of returning when we least expect it. And sometimes, it doesn't knock, it just slips under the door and waits for us to pick it up. When she finally broke the seal, the words were careful, polite, almost sweet. Her mother wrote of better days, how the family's luck had turned, how things were easier now. There was talk of a new shop in town, of neighbors asking after Margaret, of fresh linens and warm meals at the table again. And then, near the end, came the line that turned Margaret's heart cold. We'd welcome you back now, especially if you've learned to present yourself more respectably. There it was, the condition. Not a homecoming. A performance. All the old expectations folded neatly into one sentence, quietly telling her she'd be welcome only if she came back better. If she was prettier, softer, more like the girl her mother had always wanted, but never had. Margaret folded the letter slowly and set it down, because in that moment, something inside her settled, not in anger, but in clarity. She thought back to the girl she'd once been. 17, unwanted, sold for silver, carrying shame she didn't earn. A girl who believed love had to be earned by changing who you are. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was a woman now. A woman who had built her worth, not from praise, but from action. From firelight kitchens and corral fences. From scars earned and lessons learned. From the way she was looked at by people who saw her, really saw her not for what she lacked, but for what she carried. That letter, it wasn't an invitation. It was a reminder that sometimes the family we're born into can't see us until we've already seen ourselves. Margaret didn't write back. Instead, she walked out into the fields, the sky stretching wide above her, and found Steady repairing a fence post. When he saw her, he didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't press. He just stood and opened his arms. And in that quiet, she stepped into them, not to be rescued, but to be held by someone who didn't need her to be anyone else. Because love without conditions, that's the kind that heals, that endures, that frees. Margaret had once believed she was worth 30 silver coins. Now she knew she was worth everything she chose to become. There's a quiet kind of strength that comes when you finally know what you deserve, not because someone tells you, but because you've lived your way into it. For Margaret, that strength didn't roar. It didn't raise its voice. It simply whispered, no more. No more begging to be enough. No more trying to earn love through obedience or appearances. No more shrinking herself to fit a place she was never meant to belong. The letter from her mother had offered what looked like an olive branch a way back. A fresh start. A seat at the family table. But behind the pleasantries, behind the new curtains and fuller pantry, was the same old condition. Be someone else, and we'll love you. But Margaret had changed. Not in spite of what she'd been through, but because of it. She'd learned that real love doesn't measure your worth by your beauty, or your silence, or your ability to make other people comfortable. It doesn't ask you to twist yourself into a softer version, or dim your fire to keep from burning too bright. Real love sees you exactly as you are, flaws, grit, wild heart and all, and says, stay, you don't have to earn this. That love had never come from her childhood home. It came from the kitchen table at Circle B, where people passed bread without keeping score. It came from Mrs. Barrett's steady presence, from the horses who trusted her hands, from the land that taught her to rise early, stand tall, and come back stronger. And of course, it came from Steady, not because he saved her, but because he didn't need her to be anything other than the woman she was becoming. He loved her not because she was perfect, but because she was real. There's something profoundly human about the choice to walk away from a love that's conditional, even if it comes dressed as family, tradition, or comfort. And there's something even more powerful about walking toward a love that's uncertain but true. Margaret didn't return home. Because home, she realized, wasn't a place, it was a feeling. It was the sound of her name spoken without judgment. It was the arms that held her without asking her to change. It was waking up each day, knowing she was free to be entirely herself. And in that choice, quiet, steady, and undeniably her own Margaret found everything she had ever been searching for: a sense of belonging, a deep, unwavering self-worth, and a love not rooted in conditions, but in truth. She had once been a girl traded for silver. Now she was a woman who knew her value could never be priced. And that, in the end, made all the difference. There are some questions that don't need grand gestures to feel monumental. They come softly, in quiet places, and yet they carry the weight of everything you've lived, everything you've longed for. That's how it was with Steady. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those golden Wyoming dusks where the sky stretched wide and pink, and the air smelled faintly of hay and pine. Margaret had just finished folding linens on the porch, the kind of task that had once made her feel invisible. But not anymore. Now it felt like grounding, like peace. Steady came up the steps slower than usual, something thoughtful in his eyes. He held nothing in his hands, no flowers, no ring, no performance. Just honesty. "I got offered work out in Montana," he said quietly. "Better pay, bigger spread. The kind of chance I wouldn't have had a few years ago." Margaret felt the air still. He didn't need to say the rest. She could already feel the cliff edge of what was coming. Then he looked at her, not just looked, but saw her the way he always had. The girl who once couldn't meet her own reflection. The woman who had fought for herself and won. "But I won't take it," he added, "if you're not coming with me." And then, like the simplest truth in the world, he said it. "Marry me, Margaret. Not because I need to rescue you, but because I don't want to build a life without you in it." For a moment, all she could do was breathe, slowly, deeply. Because this wasn't the kind of proposal she'd imagined as a girl. It wasn't born from desperation or obligation. It didn't come with conditions or questions about what she could offer. It was just love, steady, patient, and whole. The kind of love that doesn't rush or demand. The kind that waits, and listens, and builds its future from mutual choice, not sacrifice. Margaret thought of the journey that had brought her here. From the girl who was sold for 30 silver coins, to the woman now being offered forever, not because she'd changed to be loved, but because she had grown into herself. And that was the difference. She had once believed love was something she had to earn by being quieter, softer, more convenient. But Steady had never asked her to become anyone else. He had simply stood beside her every step of the way and asked her to stay. So she said yes, not because she needed him to save her, but because she wanted to walk beside someone who knew how to see her and never looked away. And maybe that's the greatest kind of love there is, when two people choose each other not to complete one another, but to accompany each other fully, freely, without fear. In the fading light, with nothing but the breeze and the wide sky as witness, Margaret chose not just him, but herself, her worth, her freedom, her future. And that made all the difference. There was no trembling in her voice, no hesitation in her eyes. When Margaret said yes, it wasn't the shy, uncertain yes of a girl hoping to be chosen. It was the calm, grounded, radiant yes of a woman who finally knew without doubt that she was already enough. That moment on the porch, standing under a sky painted in the soft gold of early evening, Margaret looked at Steady and smiled. Not just with her lips, but with something deeper, a quiet certainty, the kind that only comes after you've walked through fire and learned you can build a life from ash. "Yes," she said, simply. "But not because I need to be saved. Because I choose you. And I choose myself. For so long, she'd lived in a world that told her she wasn't the kind of girl who got happy endings. Not pretty enough. Not soft enough. Not worthy of the kind of love that held space for her dreams, her voice, her rough edges. But Steady had never tried to smooth her out. He had only ever made room. And now she had made her own room within herself for joy. Margaret's yes wasn't just to a man, it was to a life. A future she had earned not by bending or changing, but by becoming. She said yes because she no longer mistook love for sacrifice. She no longer saw happiness as something reserved for other people. And most of all, she no longer measured her worth by the reflection in someone else's eyes, but by the strength in her own. This was the kind of love she had waited for without even knowing it, the kind rooted in choice, not need. In respect, not rescue. Some people believe that happy endings are made of perfect dresses, candlelight, and applause. But Margaret's happy ending was made of open skies, calloused hands, and the man beside her who knew her soul better than her face. And perhaps that's what real love looks like, not a fairy tale, but a partnership. Not a pedestal, but a shared ground. Not a longing to be completed, but the quiet joy of walking side by side, both whole as they stood together. The ranch behind them and the horizon ahead. Margaret felt no fear. Just peace, just power. Just the soft, steady rhythm of a heart that had finally come home. She had once been the girl sold for silver. Now she was the woman who said yes, not because she was lucky to be loved, but because she knew, fully and finally, that she deserved to be. It wasn't a grand cathedral or a ballroom bathed in chandeliers. There were no crystal goblets or silk-covered chairs. The wedding took place under the open sky, where the wind whispered through the prairie grass and the sun cast soft gold. Across the land Margaret had come to call home. At the heart of the Circle B Ranch, right between the barn and the cottonwoods, a simple arch stood woven with wildflowers picked by the hands of friends, not florists. And beneath that arch, surrounded by the people who had watched her rise from forgotten girl to fierce woman, Margaret said, "I do." The ceremony was small, but every soul there mattered. There were ranch hands standing tall in their Sunday best, eyes glistening with quiet pride. Mrs. Barrett, misty-eyed but smiling, held Margaret's hand before the vows and whispered, "You were always meant to bloom here." Mr. Barrett, who rarely spoke in more than grunts and nods, clapped Steady on the shoulder and gave Margaret a bow that meant far more than words ever could. And then there was Samuel, her older brother, once distant, now present. He had come a long way, not just in miles, but in understanding. Time had passed, things had changed, and though he couldn't undo what had been done, his presence at the wedding was a quiet apology. A bridge rebuilt not with speeches, but with presence. And when he hugged her genuinely, firmly, it felt like another thread had mended in the tapestry of her heart. Steady looked at Margaret like she was both sunrise and steady ground. And Margaret, standing there in a simple cream dress stitched by Mrs. Barrett's own hands, didn't feel like a bride pretending to be someone else's dream. She felt like herself whole, chosen, free. There were no extravagant declarations, no perfect rehearsed vows. Just two people who had walked through struggle and found something gentle and true in each other. The vows were spoken with quiet conviction. And when they exchanged rings, simple, silver bands forged by a local blacksmith, there wasn't a dry eye in the field. And maybe that's the most beautiful kind of wedding. Not the one that dazzles from the outside, but the one that hums. With meaning, with stories, with healing, because this wasn't just a wedding. It was a celebration of survival, of forgiveness, of growth. Of a woman who had once been deemed unlovable by a world too blind to see her light, and who now stood, radiant and unshaken, surrounded by people who saw her clearly. That day, Margaret wasn't just marrying the man she loved. She was being honored, that she was being witnessed, not as the girl sold for 30 silver coins, but as the woman who turned pain into purpose, who turned exile into belonging, who turned silence into voice and stood proudly at the center of her own story. And in that moment, with the wind in her hair and the horizon stretching wide behind her, Margaret smiled. She had never felt more loved, or more worthy of it. And that was the truest vow of all. As the evening sun dipped below the Wyoming hills and the laughter from the wedding faded into soft music and shared stories, Margaret stood for a quiet moment beneath the cottonwood tree alone, but not lonely. The wind played gently with the ends of her hair. She looked out over the land that had changed her and realized something so simple yet so powerful. Something no mirror had ever told her. She was beautiful, not in the way the world had once tried to define for her. Not in perfect features or polished clothes. Not in the fleeting glow of youth or in the approval of others. Her beauty had been forged like iron through fire, resilience, and choice. She had once been a girl who flinched at her reflection, who believed she was too plain to be worth loving, who thought beauty belonged to the loudest, softest, or shiniest people in the room. But standing there now, a married woman, a respected rancher, a survivor and a creator of her own joy, Margaret saw it clearly. True beauty, she now knew, is the quiet strength to keep going when the world says you shouldn't. It's the soft heart that stays kind even after it's been broken. It's the courage to speak, to forgive, to protect, to dream. It's found in hands that work hard and hearts that stay open. She remembered how Steady had once told her she had gentle hands. At the time, she thought it was just kindness. But now, she understood he'd seen her long before she saw herself. And that's what love does. It doesn't create beauty. It reveals it. Margaret had spent too many years measuring herself against other girls. Now she understood that every woman carries a light that can't be compared, because it's made of different stories, different scars, different songs. She whispered the words, maybe just to herself. Beauty is courage. Beauty is kindness. Beauty is love freely given and freely received. It wasn't the kind of revelation that needed to be shouted. It just needed to be known. Fully, quietly, deeply. Margaret turned back toward the house, where Steady waited for her on the porch, holding 2 mugs of warm cider, her home, her heart, her choice. And as she walked, shoulders steady, step sure, she didn't wonder what others saw when they looked at her. Because now, finally, she knew what she saw. And that was enough. More than enough. That was beautiful.